And again, it is with great pleasure that I'm going to introduce Dr. Eric Jardine. He is a professor at Virginia Tech and a senior fellow with the Center for International Governance Innovation. And his research includes measurement in cybersecurity, the uses and abuses of the dark web, and how the introduction of new security technologies can paradoxically produce higher levels of insecurity. He is also the author of the book, Look Who's Watching, Surveillance, Treachery, and Trust Online. And it's with great pleasure that NCI is partnering with him for this presentation on policing the dark web, a futile undertaking.
Thank you, Brian. It's my pleasure to be here, and really I would give my thanks to the NCI, to Karen Jackson, and to everyone else for hosting me. This is the second event I've done for the NCI, the first being a in-person lecture back in the fall down in Martinsville, also on the topic of the dark web, in that case focusing on ransomware threats as they emanate from the sort of bowels of the internet. The talk today is on policing the dark web, as was mentioned. And before I turn to that, I want to just provide a few comments about myself and my background. I'm, as said, an assistant professor of political science at Virginia Tech. And in that capacity, I teach a number of classes on internet governance, the sort of human and regulatory and organizational side of cybersecurity, as well as a course called the Dark Web and Threat Analytics, where students actively engage with dark web content in a controlled environment in order to try to sort of generalize up into policy relevant conclusions and prescriptions. I'm also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, which was my home before coming to Virginia Tech, and in that capacity sort of work on a variety of cybersecurity related projects. And I know they helped promote this event, so I'm grateful for them, to them for that. What we're going to be focusing on today is, as I said, the policing of the dark web and an assessment of its effectiveness. I'm going to mute my video for the course of the slides, and I'll unmute it again or at the end, just so that you're not distracted by my face and we can just sort of hear my voice and focus on the slides themselves. So to begin with an overview, we're going to start by clearing a little bit of conceptual ground. And I'm going to talk about the dark web in 4 words. Ultimately, the description surrounding those 4 words is somewhat longer than that, but I like to assume nothing in terms of background knowledge when dealing with a topic like the dark web. And so this first portion of the talk will just sort of lay out the conceptual ground, so we all have a common foundation from which we can sort of understand what we're talking about when we say darknet markets and drug crypto markets and the like. Following that initial discussion, I'll walk through a quick mapping of the parameters of what we know about the dark web, as well as some specifics about trends in the darknet market ecosystem. This talk is going to especially focus on the drug marketplaces that are hosted within the dark web. There are obviously other threats that emanate from that space, and in particular, child abuse imagery sites, which we'll return to when we're talking about some of the challenges for effective policing. The third sort of phase of the presentation is going to go through a few of the known examples of law enforcement activity in sort of broad terms, while also referencing specific operations that have been undertaken that have utilized these tactics and techniques to great effect. And I'll focus on one called Operation Bayonet, which was done in 2017. That was quite an effective operation that leveraged both some of the high-tech tools that are at law enforcement's disposal, but also a great amount of international coordination and collaboration. I'll then turn to highlight what I characterize as 3 predominant challenges for effective policing, and then we can turn, of course, to questions in a fuller conversation. As Brian mentioned at the beginning, to everyone sitting in the waiting room, the video and audio is muted, so we can use the chat function to handle the initial conversation during the Q&A, and should things warrant it, we can work on, say, selectively unmuting and that kind of thing. So to begin, the conceptual ground needs to be cleared, and I'm going to focus on, for the duration of the talk, one portion of the wider sort of dark web, which is really a segment of different technologies, and that is the Tor-hosted dark web. There are other technologies you can use to access the dark web. Freenet and I2P, or the Invisible Internet Project, are 2 of the nearest peer competitors, but Tor is the biggest. It has the most daily activity, the most content. It is the biggest focus of law enforcement and the biggest hub of criminal activity, which is sort of the focus of the talk today. If you wanted to sort of summarize the dark web in 4 terms, you can think in terms of users. So individuals, anyone on this call could go to the Tor project webpage, they could download the Tor browser, and if they opened the Tor browser, it would look a lot like this. And it is essentially a browser that can be used to view surface web content. That would be sort of like your CNN.com or your ESPN.com, but can also be used to access hidden portions of the internet. The key thing, these hidden portions of the internet are known now as onion services. They're also previously known as hidden services. The Tor project has kind of undergone a rebranding in recent years. These onion services are essentially sites. They end in .onion as opposed to .com, but they're sites hosted internal to or located internal to the Tor network. The key feature that sort of overarches these 3 initial terms to understand the dark web is the concept of anonymity. Now, for technical reasons, which we can get into in the Q&A, but I won't overly belabor during the formal presentation, everything that the users do, everything that the administrators of the sites or the hosts of the content of the sites on Onion services do, all of this is anonymous. What this means in practice is that a user can access content without leaving telltale traces like their IP address in someone's database, or their real IP address anyways. Likewise, those who are administering hidden services can do so anonymously, and the location of those hidden services is also hidden from law enforcement. So it's not always immediately clear where even the onion services that are being accessed or that are hosting content exist in the world. And there's usually processes that need to unfold in order to find them. So you can take both of these categories, users and onion services, all sort of operating anonymously, and you can unpack some sort of top-line metrics which are provided by the Tor project itself. These are done at a country level for reasons that make a fair amount of sense if you think through the process of granting someone anonymity. For users in the United States, the moving average is around 400 daily clients. Obviously, there was a big spike in Tor clients from the United States around the start of March of this year. There have been previous spikes, there will be future spikes. It's somewhat risky to overinterpret spikes in Tor client data just because it is usually a sign of bot-related activity as opposed to genuine users. If you extrapolate up from the US numbers, which do tend to run around 300 to 400,000 daily clients per day, if you extrapolate up to a global level, you're dealing with about 2 to 2.5 million daily clients. Now, 2 important things that are useful to note with regards to clients and these numbers. The first is clients are not necessarily unique. Clients are people who have used the Tor browser within a given day. So the 300 to 400,000 US-based Tor clients might be 300 to 400,000 unique people, each using the browser once, or it can be some proportion less than that. For example, one person using the browser 400,000 times. So it's important to not sort of conflate the two, that there's some value less than the number of if you wanted to say how many individuals on a daily basis happen to use Tor. The other thing to bear in mind is that the Tor browser, which is being leveraged with these Tor client numbers, that can be used as a normal web browser to access surface web content. So you could be accessing the weather network, you could be accessing CNN.com. You don't need to be using the browser to get to the other portion of the dark web that we talked about, which are those onion services, although this would be the route you would take through the Tor browser to those onion services. Onion services themselves have exhibited a fairly upward trend over time, not just as indicated in the metrics here since the beginning of 2020, but more generally, there's been a cyclical increase over time. Early indexing efforts tended to put the number of onion services at around 35,000. 2014, 2015, 2016, that sort of vicinity, the numbers were around 45 to 60,000. Now you have a sort of a running average of around 100,000 onion services up and in operation at any one point in time. These are the sites hosted internal to the Tor network. So anonymously administered. The location of the servers hosting them is hidden from view, and they're only accessible by users who are employing the Tor browser. So this is the sort of anonymous content hosted within the Tor network that we're really going to be dwelling on for the duration of the talk. Two things I think to note with these Onion services. The first is that they're subject to a very high rate of churn. And so while you might have a sort of a moving average of around 100,000 unique .onion addresses in any given day, the proportion of that amount that would remain active over a multi-day period drops pretty fast. And so you're really talking about maybe tens of thousands of stable .onion addresses as opposed to hundreds of thousands. The other thing to note is that in context, 100,000 unique .onion addresses is minuscule when you compare it to the size of the World Wide Web. So there's a lot of media sensationalism around the idea that the deep web and dark web are 500 times bigger than the surface web. The deep web is quite massive, but the deep web is not the same as the dark web. And the dark web, with its core sort of overriding feature of anonymity, is actually quite small. That we're dealing with tens of thousands of sites, not hundreds of thousands, millions of sites, like you'd expect with the surface web or even the deep web. So we're going to dwell a little bit more on what Onion services break down to. So if there's a moving average of around 100,000 sites, there have been a variety of academic exercises that have taken random sampling of these sites and categorized them into bins, basically taking plain text pull downs of what the sites happen to host and then sort of saying what proportion of available sites that we've looked at fall into which category. At the low end, you have sites dedicated to things like gambling, guns, chat forums, news forums, and child abuse imagery sites, all of which are, according to this one indexing effort by Gareth Owen and Nick Savage, around 2% or less of the available content. And at the high end, you have fraud and market and drug sites sort of up around 9 to 15% respectively. Obviously packed in the middle there, you have a lot of other types of sites that would, I think, be broadly characterized as probably dealing with illicit activities such as hacking related sites, counterfeit sites, that sort of thing. We're going to focus primarily on the sort of 24% that are the combination of market and drug related sites for the purposes of the talk. There's a lot of information about law enforcement efforts to take these down, and so it makes it, I think, a useful sort of fodder ground to speak to issues to do with law enforcement practice and law enforcement effectiveness. So we dive into what these markets will actually look like on these hosted .onion addresses. We're basically, at first blush, looking at a run-of-the-mill e-commerce site that happens to deal in drugs. And this has been a common feature ever since the first Darknet market or crypto market innovation back in 2011 with Silk Road. These sites are branded well. They have support tabs. They have a high level of functionality that would be immediately recognizable to anyone who happens to use, say, Amazon, CIGI if you're Canadian, eBay, Etsy, any of these sorts of sites. That there are certain trappings of e-commerce that have been ported into the Darknet drug market space. And they were ported over by Ross Ulbricht, who started Silk Road. One of the big challenges with e-commerce, and a challenge that is particularly pronounced when you're dealing with illegal substances and anonymity as a dominant feature, is you need to try to figure out how to reconcile the trust deficits that are at the core of all this. If you have asynchronous transactions, if you can't put your hand on the product, you have all the makings for a market that's ripe for fraud. And so you need to find a way to build in trust indicators that would be useful for consumers and useful for vendors. And that is what e-commerce solved fairly early on and what has been ported into these marketplaces. So for example, in this particular screen, you have a vendor who has recently joined this would have been Alpha Bay marketplace, which is no longer in operation. Because this vendor is new, they have a low trust level of 1, but that's because they've completed and done no effective sales. Anyone who's used Yelp in a new city to try to find the restaurant that they want to go to will understand both the importance of these trust metrics as well as some of the effects that they're going to have. the trust metrics stand in as a surrogate for judgment, where people will basically say, I'm not sure who I'm going to trust, so I'm going to trust the crowd. And whoever has the highest number of sales and the best overall rating for the products that I want to buy is the vendor that I'm going to patronize. And so you end up with a very winner-take-all system, and we'll get to that in a few slides when we talk about just how clustered that makes transactions as they distribute across available vendors. The other trust feature that was innovated as a part of the original Silk Road, and that has been a persistent feature of these darknet drug marketplaces, is really this concept of an escrow system. And when you think through the mechanics of how you would undertake a drug deal on the dark web, you have to, for example, have a consumer who's interested in a product. That consumer has to contact the vendor. The vendor has to ask for a real-world physical address that they can send the product to, and then they need to exchange money. And absent an escrow system, you have to have one of the two parties, either the vendor or the consumer, taking a risk, a fairly large size risk, in terms of either sending product without receiving payment in the case of the vendor, or sending money without receiving product in the case of the consumer. Because of the nature of the asynchronous transaction, you can't really get around that feature until maybe we get into a world of 3D printing or something like that. Into this breach, you had the innovation of market-based escrow systems, where the markets placed themselves as a trusted third party that would act as both a dispute resolver in the instance that the vendor and the consumer were saying there was drugs shipped but not received or something to that effect, and would hold money in escrow until the transaction was complete, and then would release the consumer's money to the vendor. This escrow system has led to a phenomenon known as exit scams, where market administrators, once the escrow builds up to a sufficient amount of money, have actually absconded with people's funds and basically closed out the darknet marketplaces. And as a response to that, you've got a growing trend towards more secure multi-signature escrow systems and decentralized escrow systems, as well as peer-to-peer transactions between known vendors and known consumers, which go off-market, making them even more difficult to track, and that occur via platforms like Telegram or WhatsApp. Okay, so we have a good sense of what the markets will look like. So these would be Tor-hosted .onion address marketplaces. You can kind of call them darknet marketplaces. You can call them crypto markets. I kind of use all the terms synonymously, but their overriding features are they're hosted on Tor, they use cryptocurrencies to make transactions, and they have these trust features built in order to try to facilitate e-commerce in an environment with asynchronous transactions, anonymity, and illicit activity. If you wanted to categorize the market ecosystem, so this is not any individual site, but the prevalence of darknet drug trade overall, it sort of started with fairly humble beginnings. And there's a great book by Nick Bilton called American Gangster that focuses on the Dread Pirate Roberts, or Ross Ulbricht, who started Silk Road back in 2011, and details how he was growing mushrooms in an abandoned warehouse for sale on Silk Road in the early days. But the ecosystem as a whole has moved from that into a system that, if you picked almost any measure possible, has and can continue to increase in size year over year. And so I'll give you a few examples from some of the data that my students actually use in the dark web and threat analytics class that I mentioned earlier. So if you take the number of transactions as one measure of increasing size, across 5 different dark web marketplaces, Apollon, Canahome, Canazome, Kryptonia, and Empire, you see a pretty similar pattern, that over the course of 2019, these 5 marketplaces each exhibited a generally upward trajectory in terms of their number of sales. The most significant, obviously, would have been the trend line for the Apollon marketplace, which in the 12th month of 2019 did 23,524 sales just on that one marketplace. Summed together, we're looking at about 218,000 transactions for various drug-related items across these 5 marketplaces in 2019. If you looked at the issue of revenue, you'd see something similar for just 4 marketplaces. All 4 are exhibiting a similar pattern for the course of 2019, with more sales in Bitcoin converted to US dollars using Bitcoin conversion price from a couple of days ago. Kryptonia, which was active and then went offline during this period, was the most pronounced, upwards of $34 million clearing that marketplace in the fourth quarter of 2019. These numbers are all scraped from these sites, which publish this information as a way of building the trust that has to be inherent to the e-commerce platform itself. If you were to sum up all of these numbers, all of this Bitcoin revenue converted to US dollars into a total amount of revenue for this year for these four marketplaces, you have about $87 million in total revenue flowing through. That equates to about 0.02% of the total drug trade. So there's a few things to note in this respect. First, as a proportion of global drug trade, darknet markets remain a relatively peripheral item in that they are not, accounting for 25-35% of global drug trade. It's significantly smaller than that. The other thing to note is that this is only 4 marketplaces. And there are many others that are currently in operation, which would also be recording revenue that isn't being counted. And that along the same lines, that this proportion of global drug trade that is being eaten up by the darknet marketplace ecosystem has continued to increase over time. Now, I mentioned earlier that the trust features that are inherent to e-commerce platforms tend to produce a winner-take-all environment. So this 87 million in total revenue is not going to be evenly distributed across vendors within a given marketplace. And I think you can see this across 3 example markets, Apollon, Empire, and Kryptonia. These have differences in terms of the number of total vendors, as well as the number of total transactions. But you see a pretty common pattern in looking at the proportion of total transaction numbers that are eaten up by the top 10, top 50, and top 100 vendors. So you have very top-heavy marketplaces where around anywhere from 18.5 to about 22% of all transactions are conducted by just 10 vendors on each of these marketplaces. The top 50 vendors, they account for roughly around 50% of all sales, and the top 100 vendors anywhere between 60 and 80% of all the sales that happen on this marketplace. What this ends up suggesting is you have a winner-take-all environment that is produced through mechanisms of preferential attachment that are very common in sort of a gig economy and e-commerce type environment. And it also means from a law enforcement perspective that you can be highly effective if you can target top vendors at disrupting a large proportion of transactions and trade, which is a useful sort of general lesson to note. So the market ecosystem, as I said, has grown. It's grown unevenly with clear winners like the top 10 vendors here and clear losers, those people who would be at the bottom of the vending pile. But despite its continual growth, law enforcement has not been inactive in terms of actually trying to police and take down these various marketplaces. This is a partial sort of timeline of operations and takedowns, starting with Silk Road, which ran from about 2011 to the end of to the fall of 2013, when it was taken down in Operation Marco Polo. You then have a series of additional markets spring up in its wake, many of which were removed with Operation Onimus. Operation Bayonet closed Alpha Bay and Hansa in 2017, and Operation Saboteur closed Valhalla and Wall Street Market in 2019. You have, I think, all the markings of an active environment that is growing larger and larger over time, and an increasingly heavy hand of law enforcement engagement and efforts to try to police the system. So we can talk then a little bit about how law enforcement has been able to do these various operations to effectively take down these darknet drug or darknet crypto market sites hosted internal to Tor. I like to think through the sort of broad swaths of law enforcement approaches to policing darknet crypto market sites in terms of their scalability and in terms of their technical sophistication. So in this respect, at the lower end of the scalability and technical sophistication side of things, you have undercover operations. So this was used to great effect during Operation Marco Polo that took down Silk Road 1, where law enforcement was able to embed operatives within Silk Road's administrative structure. This led to a wealth of information and ultimately a variety of arrests. It's not a particularly scalable sort of exercise. You can't have 1 million undercover operatives running around trying to infiltrate darknet crypto markets, but it can be a highly effective technique if used correctly. An interesting alternative approach are what are known as knock and talk exercises, which we've seen a couple of instances of. One would have been Operation Hyperion, where law enforcement agencies from a number of countries around the world, and Operation Disarray, which was an FBI-based operation, would essentially leverage information harvested from the servers of previous crypto markets that had been taken down and commandeered by law enforcement to visit people that were engaged in the purchase or sale of drugs via darknet crypto markets. And these knock and talk exercises are meant to be deterrents. They're meant to say, basically, we know that you have been buying or selling from these sites. We want you to know that we know, and therefore we might run a chance of deterring you from engaging in this activity in the future. Mail screening is part and parcel of this, of any operation in this space, simply because it is the final mile that has to be traversed by vendors and consumers. So you end up with, if you walk through the crime script associated with purchasing drugs on a darknet crypto market, at the final stage, the consumer needs to supply a physical world mailing address, and the vendor needs to ship the drugs to that address. That means, depending on where they're originating and where they're going, you might be traversing national borders, you're at a minimum traversing the postal system, and as a result of all of that, there's a lot of opportunity for interception. And this has been used to great effect in a number of operations, not just Operation Saboteur, but others as well. Tracking the money as an approach often works in any kind of criminal investigation, and again, no different in the context of darknet drug marketplaces. In this case, one example to sort of highlight would be the takedown of SynMed by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. In this particular case, SynMed was 3 guys in New Jersey who were making counterfeit Xanax tabs, and they'd laundered upwards of $2.3 million in cryptocurrencies and shipped over 1,000 packages of Xanax to 43 states in the continental US. And they were sort of characterized as among the top 3 active vendors on the Dream marketplace. And what ended up getting them caught was basically an effort to launder cryptocurrency and Bitcoin into cash. So they were using Bitcoin to fund prepaid credit cards and then going to ATMs to withdraw that money and turn it into cash in order to continue to buy the products that they needed to make their counterfeit pharmaceuticals. Ultimately, this got on the radar of law enforcement and these ATM withdrawals, and that ended up leading to the arrest and breakup of that entire vendor ring. You can also track the money via the blockchain underlying Bitcoin, though increasingly users of darknet crypto markets employ tumbling techniques that make that harder to do. At the sort of high end of scalability and sophistication, you have the use of network investigative techniques, which essentially hack the technology of Tor, as well as what are known as honeypots, which I'll describe in a little bit more detail in a second as we walk through what I think is one of the best examples of sort of international collaboration, really having being a technically sophisticated operation that leverages high levels of international collaboration. And that would be Operation Bayonet that took down Alphabet and Hansa. So originally in the course of Operation Bayonet, you kind of had 2 parallel operations running in tandem. The first was an operation by the Dutch National High-Tech Crime Unit that was targeting the Hansa marketplace, which was sort of at that time the #2 marketplace in terms of size within the ecosystem. And they'd located the server hosting the site in Lithuania. That is sort of an essential prerequisite of a lot of these operations and not an easy thing to do given the anonymity granted by the Tor network for the hidden services or the onion services. But they located and commandeered this site. And they essentially decided that rather than simply shutting down Hansa, they were going to run it as a honeypot. And so they were going to change the underlying code of the site in a variety of ways that would benefit them in terms of collecting information from vendors and consumers. So a couple of tweaks that they made to the site allowed them, for example, to record as plain text the PGP encrypted messages that were going between customers and vendors. They were also able to store copies of user passwords, and they also tweaked functionality of the sites so that it would no longer strip metadata out of the photos that were uploaded to advertise products. They combined that function with an engineered server glitch that deleted all of the currently uploaded photos, and that prompted a number of vendors to re-upload photos that wouldn't be stripped for metadata, which allowed law enforcement to make 50 additional arrests as a result of that one particular ploy. So having re-engineered the site to be essentially a data collecting instrument, the Dutch National Police partnered with the FBI, which took down Alpha Bay in collaboration with international partners, ultimately arresting its administrator in Thailand. And the whole entire combination of efforts here sort of hinged on a common sort of understanding about what the effect of the takedown of a big marketplace like Alpha Bay was going to do to the second place marketplaces in the system. And in this case, everyone kind of suspected you take Alpha Bay offline, users are going to go to Hansa, which was the next biggest market. And at this point, it was still unknown to the general user community that the Hansa marketplace had been commandeered by the Dutch National Police. So after the shutdown of Alpha Bay, you saw exactly what everybody kind of expected would happen, which was a massive spike in new user enrollment on Hansa. This information was all getting collected and recorded based on the tweaks that the National High-Tech Crime Unit had made to the site. After a period of time, the volume of new user activity actually got to such a level that the Dutch police closed down new registrations for a period of 10 days. The reason behind that was that under EU law, it was required that they were logging all of the transactions that they were observing, and there were so many new users flooding the sites that it was becoming labor prohibitive to do so. So they closed registration for a period, reopened on the 16th, and ultimately leading to another spike of about 7,000 new users, again, who would be walking through a system that had been designed to harvest as much information as possible about their activities, their details, their location, anything else that could be gleaned from all the information in photos or in PGP logs or anything like that. So this operation, I think, showcases that law enforcement is effective often at taking down marketplaces. They're not simply running around trying to play whack-a-mole, as it is sometimes characterized, that there is a lot of collaboration and a lot of tech savvy being leveraged to try to gain as much information as possible from these marketplaces rather than just shuttering them and then moving on to the next marketplace. And this is a sort of an increasingly common pattern where you're shutting down some, you're trying to run some as honeypots, and overarching all of this is collaboration internationally between state and federal level law enforcement agencies. Now, despite that, and despite a record of success where multiple marketplaces have been closed over the years and continue to be closed, there remains a series of challenges for law enforcement. I characterize these, very roughly speaking, as issues to do with persistence, issues to do with adaptability, and then issues to do with law and jurisdiction. And we can walk through each of these in turn in a little bit more detail to get a precise sense of exactly what I mean. So on the persistence front, for example, one of the things that has been well established in the empirical literature focusing on the effect of takedowns is that they give nothing but very short-run effects at an ecosystem level. So by that, I essentially mean you don't see a takedown leading to large drop-offs in activity that are sustained in any kind of meaningful time unit. So for example, one study parsed the effect of crackdowns, in this case, Operation Onimus, which shuttered a number of marketplaces, and looked at, for example, the number of listings. This would be the number of products that were on offer before the operation was undertaken and after the operation was undertaken. So on the after side of things, it's the remaining markets that weren't closed, and before the operation, it was all the markets that were up and running at that point in time. You do see a drop. So there's no doubt that there is some disruption as a result of law enforcement operations. It's just very short-lived. So in this particular case, with regards to the number of listings, you're sort of dropping from slightly over 50,000 in October of 2014 down into around 30,000 for a few months. And then once you're into the new year, you actually see the numbers recover and then quickly surpass the previous total. So the number of listings proved to be very resilient at an ecosystem level, and the market continued to persist in sort of upward trajectory towards bigger and bigger and bigger. You see something similar, if even more pronounced, when you're looking at the actual number of transactions. So this would be the number of sales. In the empirical literature, this is usually measured by the number of consumer feedback posts that are left. These are often mandated by marketplaces, so they are a pretty good proxy for the number of transactions. And what you see in this instance is again, Operation Animus slightly disrupted the occurrence of transactions. You do see a drop from about 45,000 transactions in October before Operation Animus to maybe a low point in December of around 25,000, say. But very quickly, come the new year, the marketplace recovers and in fact goes on to almost double in size in terms of the number of transactions just by March of 2015. And so you see the same pattern play itself out in terms of the persistence of vendors. The rate of growth of new vendors on marketplaces also appears to be fairly stable despite the occurrence of disruptions. So not only are they not necessarily reducing the total numbers, they're not actually reducing the rate at which new transactions, listings, or vendors happen in the ecosystem. That overall, the ecosystem as a whole is incredibly resilient and persistent despite efforts to police specific marketplaces and to take those marketplaces down. You also have issues to do with adaptability. This is, I think, will come as no surprise to anyone who sort of pauses to think it through, but if you're dealing with an adversarial environment, you're going to end up with sort of a darknet marketplace version of nature's Red Queen's race. That you'll have people on the vendor or consumer side discussing the historical events, trying to game out where things went wrong and what can be done in order to improve on security outcomes in the future. So one study digested these digested forum postings from Silk Road 1 to basically look at the ways in which users were discussing ways to improve security procedures so that everybody in the ecosystem could be a little bit safer overall. 47% of the posts that they sort of categorized were talking about shipping methods, which is the sort of that last mile and in some ways far more, by far the most risky side of the darknet marketplace ecosystem, at least in terms of a vendor or consumer's vulnerability to law enforcement. And you see advice being shared in this context, such as your postman knows your name. Please give me your real name, the same name all your mail goes to. Using fake names can alert the authorities, meaning your shipment may not arrive and may actually get seized. Neither of us wants that to happen. Likewise, you have fairly widespread discussion, 33% of postings, of stealth measures, which are things like vacuum sealing bags and product shipment sizes and things of that sort that are meant to get a product through intensive screening at national borders or by postal inspection agencies. In this case, you have, for example, this piece of advice: if you ship a parcel that weighs over 13 ounces, you need to go to the post office, be recorded on camera, and fill in a customs form, make it fit in a bubble envelope, and avoid all of this. Now, perhaps this is good advice, perhaps this is bad advice. I think the point that I'm trying to sort of illustrate is that there is a high level of adaptability and group learning that goes on in this space. And you actually have seen the same sort of pattern exhibited, not just in terms of advice about shipping methods, but also in discussions about what the best escrow system is, the use of PGP as an encryption technology to try to ensure your messages are secured, as well as increasingly in more contemporary terms, discussion of moving drug sales off of marketplaces, which are these sort of centralized nodes that are easy to target, and toward distributed sort of sales via platforms like Telegram. So there's a high level of adaptability. So every move that law enforcement makes gets analyzed in immense detail, and best practices seem to sort of devolve out of the collective hive mind of these marketplaces and become sort of set security procedures going forward. The final challenge that I'll point to has to do with law and jurisdiction. And in this case, I think there's really two main points that I'll draw attention to. These are sort of US-centric in terms of the precise laws and points that I'll make, but I think probably apply to any liberal democratic regime. The first is issues to do with the Fourth Amendment in the US, which has to do with governing sort of permissible search and seizures. This, the Fourth Amendment plays itself out through Rule 41B of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. And the issue here is that, especially when you're using network investigative techniques, which search devices and collect device level information, you run into issues of jurisdiction fairly quickly. So the primary sort of case study in this potential sort of set of issues surrounding law and jurisdiction was an FBI operation named Operation Pacifier in 2015, which took down a child abuse imagery ring. And as a part of that, they used a network investigative technique. They basically commandeered a site, ran the site for 13 days, and used a network investigative technique to hack the site. And so that users of the site were essentially infecting their computer with a program that would harvest information and return that to the FBI. So you would take your IP address, your real IP address, your MAC address, and a variety of other bits of information and send it to servers being run by the FBI. There was a warrant authorized in the Eastern District of Virginia to launch this search using this network investigative technique. But the problem is Rule 41B of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure at the time did not allow for magistrate judges to issue searches outside of their jurisdiction. And in this case, several hundred searches were conducted all over the United States through this through this technique and as authorized by this one warrant. And globally, you had about 8,000 devices being searched, again, simply with the authorization of a single Virginia magistrate. These problems of jurisdiction, I think, can be oversold by the same in that when when cases from this investigation hit the courts, they often sided with the idea that the FBI had acted in good faith, which I think they probably had. And since this time in 2015, Rule 41B has actually been amended to include a proviso stating that if there's evidence that obfuscation technologies, such as the use of Tor, are at play, then a judge can authorize a warrant even if they're not sure where the physical location of the devices to be searched happen to be. So within the US anyways, these jurisdictional questions are somewhat less pronounced than they were even a handful of years ago, but generally speaking, you're still running into an issue of you're searching devices that could be hosted in any country, anywhere, and that can create a series of international challenges and domestic legal challenges as well. The other legal dimension that I'll point to here before concluding has to do with the Sixth Amendment, which is essentially, I would characterize as kind of a bundle of procedural rights surrounding, the right to be informed of what you're accused of, the right to review evidence, the right to face your accuser, all of that sort of thing. The difficulty in the case of network investigative techniques is that they are lines of code, and these lines of code are what are being used to harvest information that can be then used to get residential warrants and conduct searches of houses and things like that. But these lines of code are effective only as long as they remain secret. That if they are disclosed publicly, you can bet to the adaptability point before that the Tor project will reverse engineer what they're doing, find the initial flaw that's being exploited and patch that flaw, making users of the Tor network invulnerable to that particular approach in the future. And since there's a finite number of flaws in any given amount of code base, these network investigative techniques are very valuable for government, and they can be used across multiple investigations simultaneously. And so it's in the interest of the government to not disclose the network investigative technique, but they are increasingly being challenged on Sixth Amendment grounds to say that they must disclose. And this sort of process of what is known as gray mailing is becoming increasingly common, and I'm aware of at least one case stemming from the Operation Pacifier wherein the government dropped charges as opposed to disclosing the content of the technique that they ended up using. And so to sum up, I would basically conclude that you do have a sort of positive trajectory in terms of the market ecosystem overall. That the Darknet drug marketplaces are getting bigger, they're involving more transactions, there's larger volumes of revenue flowing through them. All of that seems to be continuing apace despite the efforts of law enforcement, but law enforcement has also over time become increasingly sophisticated at actually leveraging the approaches and techniques that are available to them and taking down these marketplaces. There are, I think, challenges that persist. the perpetual growth of this ecosystem being one example, the adaptability of the system being another, and challenges to do with law and jurisdiction being a third. But I would hesitate to say that there is a real difference in kind here between the sort of challenges that law enforcement might face with the offline drug marketplace. That anytime you were to break up a drug ring in a particular area, the chances are that it will be quickly replaced until you deal with the demand side of things with regards to drugs. It's likely to persist. So the persistence is relatively similar, as is issues to do with the adaptation, and law and jurisdiction has always sort of set boundaries to who can do what where. So I would characterize this as essentially differences in kind between the physical world challenges and the challenges in the digital ecosystem, but they're not inconsiderable, and they sort of need to be thought through in, I think, some concrete detail. And so with that, I'm going to thank you all for your time. I'll turn my video back on and, of course, welcome any questions, comments, critiques, that kind of thing. All right, and so I will pull up the chat.
Yes, so if you guys have any questions, feel free to use the chat feature to ask those now. Again, thank you, Dr. Eric Jardine, for doing this for us. It was a great presentation. I learned a lot, so I'm very appreciative of you doing this. And I would also like to give a shout out to 2 other NCI staff that joined, Christina Reed and Rebecca Hughes. Thank you guys for joining us today. And we have our first question from Sean.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I can read the question
Okay.
out, just in case people have joined via their phone or something like that and they can't see the chat. And then I'll give a brief response. So Sean asked, has there been any success in identifying supply chains leading to dark web markets? I think the sort of contingent answer is some. There is some evidence that the supply chain is not what you might think. So I'll step back and say that there's always that possibility with a transnational technology like this, that what you'd end up with is a process that cuts out a lot of the middle steps. So we know sort of general drug supply corridors, for example, like from Latin America up into North America or over into Europe or wherever else. But the interesting thing is that predominantly what we do not observe is that those corridors become unimportant. That you don't see, for example, cocaine produced in Latin America flowing directly via drug marketplaces to consumers in North America. What we see instead is that what you tend to have is physical world trafficking to high consumption areas, and then those high consumption areas redistribute via drug crypto markets. I think some of this makes sense in light of the predominant user base of these marketplaces. There's a big cluster of consumers in Europe, North America, and Australia. You also get sorry, I just heard a knock on my door. You also get you also do see certain drugs, for example, flowing out of China with a high degree of regularity. But generally speaking, what we're dealing with here is a tool of redistributing drugs once they're already in high consumption areas. There is some evidence that about maybe 15 to 20 to 25% of transactions on Silk Road and some of the earlier marketplaces were wholesale related. So they would have been redistributing the availability of drugs within a geographic location. So you'd have people buying to do social supply or local resupply, as opposed to simply trying to purchase for individual consumption. So, you know, a lot of this is a bit unclear in terms of the geographic distribution, but you do not see direct source to consumer shipments. The pre-existing supply chains seem to be still dominant in a lot of cases. All right. AJ asked, have you seen any terrorism related activity within the dark web? So the short answer there is some, but you gotta be very qualified in how you kind of think through terrorist related activity. one empirical investigation that was, again, categorizing available Darknet content found that about 2% of sites were what they categorize as extremist sites. That number has probably increased in recent years due to increased moderation of surface websites. So there were sites like the Daily Stormer that were previously hosted on the surface web and then were sort of moderated out of existence by their DNS provider, Google, and a variety of, and Cloudflare, and then they've ended up migrating to the dark web, and that's been kind of a common pattern or in recent years. So there's probably more sort of extreme political sites and extremist sites and terrorist sites on the dark web than there used to be. But that being said, it's also not that easy to find content and not that easy to go there. And so you actually end up with it being a pretty poor tool for certain purposes for extremist groups. Like propaganda purposes, the darknet is not the best tool to use. You'd want to use platforms with the biggest user base like YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or something like that. So you can use it for sort of operational type sites, but in terms of propaganda, it's not the best tool. So there's some activity, but I think the worries that it's sort of a dominant feature is, I think, it's slightly overblown. Where you do get sort of a potential nexus is between drug markets, gun markets, malware markets, and terrorist activity. That there you have some, you have the possibility of terrorist organizations leveraging basically a marketplace that's sort of adjudicated by a price mechanism to buy capacity in a way that they wouldn't have previously been able to engage. All right, Katie, hello Katie. I said, are you working with the district attorney to help improve police and prosecution responses to dark web related crime? I'm not working directly with any law enforcement agencies at this point in time. I am hoping to spin up some local and state level training exercises. You know, ultimately, I think the question of who's to do what is better left to people who have that as their primary responsibility. But you know, I'm able to take a bit of a bird's eye view, and I'm happy to share my what I know to the extent that I know it definitively with whomever might be interested. All right, so 2 more questions here. Gail asked, if you use the Tor network to access YouTube, is YouTube able to track you, or does Tor block that too? So in general, if you were to use the Tor browser to access any surface web content, the site would not be able to track you. There is a few sort of provisos to that. One is you have to, within the most recent iteration of the Tor browser, you have to disable a series of functions to do with JavaScript. And the knock-on effect of that is that sometimes your functionality goes down. So you might not be able to consume sort of high bandwidth video, for example, on YouTube if you're running Tor. It might not work. But in principle, if you're using the Tor network and the Tor browser to view content, what will end up happening is your IP address, as it's seen by the site that you're visiting, will be whatever the last node in the series of hops that you take to get there happens to be. It won't be your real IP address associated with your device. All right, so Samuel said, considering the under-resourced nature of counter online underage imagery operations, the comparably non-violent nature of crypto drug markets, and the minimal evidence of any impact on the demand side, would it not make sense to shift counter crypto market resources into counter child abuse imagery efforts? I think that there's, you know, I go through an exercise with my students where we sort of walk through various indicators about activity on the darknet, and we sort of say how we can get to a sort of strategic level direction from, we can get to a variety of different points about strategic level direction from a variety of different indicators. So for example, one of the slides I showcased, that about 24% of categorized content was these sort of markets and drug related sites. It's very easy to basically extrapolate from that to say, well, that seems to be a pretty dominant feature of the system, so we should focus our energies there. In that same slide, 2% of the sites were dedicated to child abuse imagery content. One of the reasons I like the Owen and Savage indexing effort is that they also were able to track site visits. This was not in any way de-anonymizing users. It was simply recording the number of times categories got pinged effectively. And unfortunately, what they found as a part of that exercise was that over 80% of traffic was going to the 2% of sites dedicated to child abuse imagery. And so I think, you know, that different metric, that site visit metric, would tell you a pretty different story about where you should be allocating your resources. Now, you know, questions about, you know, drug policy overall, whether it should be demand side focused, supply side focused, those are sort of high level political questions that are ultimately going to be subject to a number of factors. I think you can probably make a pretty plausible case for trying to focus on both to some degree. For example, you know, the potential for darknet crypto markets to redistribute novel drugs into areas that aren't equipped to handle or haven't seen them before is not something that is an inconsiderable problem. By the same token, child abuse imagery is a pretty heinous thing to have on any part of the internet and should certainly be targeted whenever and wherever it can be. I didn't cover law enforcement efforts except for at the tail end there with Operation Pacifier targeting these sites, but they are routinely targeted and taken down as well. You also interestingly have a pretty active hacktivist environment that engages in DDoS attacks against these sites as well. Okay. All right, that seems to be the end of the questions. If there are any others, I'm happy to field them. If people wanted to reach out via email afterwards, I have that up on the screen as well, and you're welcome to do that as well. So thank you all for your attention. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to me ramble on about policing darknet crypto markets. And again, my thanks to the New College Institute for hosting me today.
Again, thank you for this awesome presentation, Dr. Eric Jardine. Again, we will have this presentation on our YouTube. Again, if you just search New College Institute, give us about a week to get that up. I look forward to working with you in the future. And again, if you have any questions, just give Dr. Jardine an email or shoot me an email, and I'd be glad to get you in touch. Thank you all for joining today.
Thanks, everyone.